Hi everyone, Kurt here, and today we're going to cover everything you might want to know about how to do your first flights in Microsoft Flight Simulator. We're also going to talk in a lot of detail about the Cessna 152. For those of you who already know the basics of how to get started, this video is divided into chapters so you can go directly to what you need. If you're going to be using auto start up or just taking off from the end of the runway, you can just skip right to the takeoff chapter. But if you're totally new and really want to know what everything does and learn about how small planes really work, stay right here and we'll cover some of that. Before I start, the instructions and descriptions that I'm giving you here are not for real-world use. This is content for Microsoft Flight Simulator only. I'm not a flight instructor, and no matter how cool I sound, a certified flight instructor is really the only correct source for real-world instruction. This is the Cessna 152. It's the first airplane most civilian pilots fly. Although the slightly larger 172 is also quite popular, many students start in the 152 simply because the operating costs are lower. Other small planes are becoming popular as trainers more recently, but if you go fly in the real world, it's very likely you'll get at least a little bit of time in a Cessna 152 at some point. They're fun to fly, and almost as fast as an angry seagull, but not quite. So watch your back if you've angered any seagulls, as you're not going to be escaping them with your 152. Since this video is directed at people with absolutely no experience with airplanes or simulators, I'll take a moment to discuss the basic control surfaces. If you already know this stuff, feel free to skip forward to the next chapter. Aircraft need to be able to move themselves in a few different ways. Pitch, which is the nose moving up and down, roll, which is banking the wings left or right, and yaw, which is moving the nose left or right. Each of these movements has a corresponding surface that affects it. Pitch is controlled by the elevators, which are seen here on the horizontal stabilizer at the rear of the plane. Pulling back on the control yoke or on your joystick in the cockpit deflects these upward, which forces the tail to go down and raises the nose of the plane. Of course, if you push forward on the yoke or your stick, it deflects the opposite direction and lowers the nose of the plane. Yaw is the side-to-side motion of the nose, and it's controlled by the rudder, which is found here on the vertical stabilizer. As you might expect, it deflects into the airstream and moves the nose of the plane to the left or the right. What you may not know if this is your first exposure to airplanes is that it is controlled by your feet in the real airplane and not by turning the yoke or pushing the joystick. In Flight Simulator, you might have this mapped to pedals on the floor or a twist function on your joystick or lots of other methods. Or if you have no rudder control for Flight Simulator can auto-coordinate the rudder for you. However, you should only use that option if you have no appropriate way to control the rudder. Roll is controlled by the ailerons, which are out near the wingtips. They move opposite of each other, and they are controlled by the left or right movement of your joystick or your yoke. Another important surface is the flaps, which are on the inner part of the wing. They help to generate a little extra lift when flying at low speeds, such as during takeoff and landing or approach. They create a lot of drag, which can be handy to help slow you down. However, their function is an interesting little area of flying that's beyond the scope of this video, so for now, just go with the idea that they generate extra lift and a little extra drag when needed. The 152 is equipped with a steerable nose wheel to control your direction while on the ground, and it's controlled using the rudder pedals on the floor. So when taxiing in a small plane, you're driving with your feet, not with your hands. It sounds complicated, but you'd really be surprised how quickly you'll pick it up. And on the front, of course, of a small plane is where you're going to find the propeller. In the case of the 152, it's directly connected to the engine output, and that's what creates your thrust. So that covers the main control surfaces. Let's hop inside and have a look at how you control it all and what's what in the cockpit. All right, here we are with the view so many real-world pilots have started with. As you can see, directly in front of you is the control yoke. It moves left and right, much like the steering wheel in your car. But it doesn't really steer like a car, it just controls the bank angle left or right. It can also be pushed forward and back to raise or lower the nose. On the floor, you can see the rudder pedals. As we already discussed, they control the rudder. Step on the left to move left, step on the right to move it right. 152s have brake pedals there too. Pressing with your toe activates the brake. Each of the main wheels has an independent brake, so by pressing on the left brake pedal, you apply the brake on that side. To apply both, you press both. This helps your aircraft to turn a little sharper on the ground. Say you've got it all the way turning right and that's not quite enough, you can just tap the right-hand brake a little bit and that'll help to pull it around a little bit quicker. Independent brakes aren't really as hard to use as you might think. Most of us have ridden a bicycle that has a front and a rear independent brake. It's really not any more complex than that. You'll learn it quickly. The 152 has a really simple cockpit layout, nothing fancy here. If you're on PC, you can click on the yoke to hide it. This works on most of the Microsoft Flight Simulator planes, and it can be handy in a small cockpit like this one because there's some things hidden behind there that you might want to be able to see. You can also hide the yoke over on the co-pilot side. We'll start from the bottom of the panel since that's where we'd start off if we were running through our checklists. The bottom part of the panel is mostly electrical, but there are a few other things here you're going to want to know about. Starting from the left is the primer. This is used to prime a little fuel into the engine when starting cold. The 152 uses an old school carbureted engine, and getting it started can sometimes require puffing a little fuel into the intake to help kick it over. Microsoft Flight Simulator's default 152 doesn't require a primer, but you should be aware that it's there in case you get an add-on that does. The red toggles next to that are the alternator and battery master. Generally, you're going to operate these two together. You'll turn them on and off at the same time. However, they can be switched separately for some unusual situations that don't really happen in the default plane. No reason to get into that right now. When your checklists say master switch on or master switch off, you can assume it means both of these. Next to that, you'll find the ignition key. It controls your magnetos and your starter. It's a little different than the key in a car, but it serves a similar purpose, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we start up. The little knob next to that is your panel floodlight. If you rotate that clockwise, it turns it brighter. Counterclockwise is dimmer. It illuminates red to preserve your night vision. The series of white switches to the right of that is mostly lights. Dome light is an overhead white light similar to the one in your car that you might use while you're on the ground for packing things into the cockpit, but you normally wouldn't have that turned on during flight, much like you don't normally drive around with the dome light on in your car. And next to the dome light, we find pitot heat. That one's used in cold or wet conditions to ensure that no ice is forming on your pitot tube. The pitot tube is a little tube outside the airplane. You can see it right outside the pilot's side window hanging down from the wing. On the front of it is a little hole. Air pressure on that tube is used to determine the airspeed for your airspeed indicator. How that exactly works is a topic for another time, but if it were to get ice in it, your airspeed needle will just freeze it wherever it is. So if you were flying along at 100 knots and you got ice in there, it would stay at 100 knots even if you came to a complete stop. Obviously, that's a pretty dangerous situation, so that pitot heater is used to prevent that. There's a similar device on basically all airplanes. Next to that is the nav lights. Nav lights are the red and green lights on the wingtip and the single white solidly lit light on the tail. They are required to be on at all times in an aircraft if the aircraft is in motion, even on the ground and in daylight. Next to that are the strobe lights. Strobe lights are high-intensity white blinking lights. They're on the wingtips of the 152, and they're there to help others see you. Most of the time on the ground they are off, however they are turned on when on the runway or when crossing a runway. In flight, it's generally pilot discretion as to have them on or off, but it's definitely a good idea to have them on when you're maneuvering near an airport or where there's other traffic. It's generally recommended to leave them on at all times if you're under 10,000 feet. Newer planes have LED lighting, so there's no reason not to leave them on all the time. However, on older planes, they had standard incandescent light bulbs, which had a tendency to burn out and were pretty expensive to replace. So a lot of pilots won't use those unless there's a reason to. However, if you have a modern LED system, or if you're in Microsoft Flight Simulator, you can just switch them on and leave them on. Just remember, when you pull off the runway after landing, they should be turned off. The switch marked BCN is the beacon light. It's the red flashing light you find on the top of the tail on the 152. However, on different airplanes, it has different locations. It is required to be on anytime the engine is running and should be before actually starting the engine. So basically, if you're planning on starting the engine, it's worth turning on the beacon at the same time you turn on the master switch. Next, we come to taxi lights. Those are for use at night on the ground, and they do an okay job of lighting the ground ahead of you, similar to car headlights. They're not as powerful, though. They also help others to see you. They should be turned off when entering the runway and while in the air. Next to that is landing lights. Just like the strobes, those should be switched on when entering the runway and should be left on below 10,000 feet. Just like strobes, LEDs can be left on all the time, but with older planes with old conventional bulbs, pilots sometimes choose to turn them off except when they're in high traffic areas or otherwise required to have them on. Next over from there, we find the elevator trim indicator and the trim wheel. Trim is used in flight to keep the pilot from having to constantly apply forward or backward pressure on the controls just to maintain level flight. We'll talk more about how to use it later on. All of the little circular black and white switches here that go off to the other side of the plane are your circuit breakers. On the default 152, they are not functional. However, some add-on planes will allow circuits to pop. Basically, all they do is if a circuit is overloaded in the electrical system, that'll pop out to prevent damage to the system, and you can just push them back in to get the item back online. However, if they pop right back out, then something's wrong, and you're going to be without whichever device that is until you can have service performed on your airplane. All right, going all the way back over to the left and one row up, we have the parking brake, which does exactly what you would expect it to do. It keeps the brakes applied so you don't have to. You just pull on that and the brake is on. Push it forward to release. Fuel gauges are next to that. You have a left tank and a right tank, each located in the wings. And the gauge on the left is the left tank, the gauge on the right is the right. The gauge is electric and it's going to show empty when the power is off. The gauge is indexed for gallons and for pounds, and they are notoriously inexact in the real world, but they do give you some idea what you've got. And as long as we're talking about fuel, there's a fuel shutoff valve on a lever on the floor here between the seats. Next over from the fuel gauges is your oil temperature and oil pressure. In the default plane, they don't really ever go wrong, but there are mods out there where this becomes more important, so it's important to know where they are. Basically, the green band there shows the normal operating range. At the end of the video, I can give you a link to one of the best 152 mods you can get, and it's even free, and it adds some complexity to these things. But when you're just getting started out, the default plane is really very good. Continuing across, we have the Carb-Heat, which is a little pull-out slider. It's another item that isn't modeled in detail in the default plane, but basically in some conditions, even on warm days, ice can form in the carburetor. This little slider diverts some hot engine air into the carburetor to prevent that problem. However, since warm air is less dense than cold air, you lose a small amount of power while this is open. Next over from there, we find the throttle and mixture controls. You're going to be using these ones a lot. Although Microsoft Flight Simulator has an assist for mixture in the options, you should learn to fly it manually. The throttle does what you would expect. Much like in your car, it increases engine power the more you push it forward. However, unlike in a car, it doesn't spring back to idle. It stays where you leave it. Mixture is a little bit more complicated, and we'll talk more about that later on. But basically, as you go higher in altitude, the air gets less dense, and this means your engine is getting more air, or more gas rather, and less air. This robs power, and eventually the engine would stall from flooding, basically. Your car doesn't suffer from this as much because the altitudes you're driving at don't usually get so high. And honestly, even if you are up high, most cars today have a computer that'll make the adjustments for the mixture for you. The 152 doesn't have any such tech, so it's your job to manage it, and that red knob is how you're going to do it. More later when we're flying. Next to that is the flaps indicator and the flaps position switch. This raises and lowers the flaps in 10-degree increments. And moving on from there are the cabin air and heat knobs, which don't do anything in the default Microsoft Flight Simulator 152. This brings us up to the main panel of the dash where our flight instruments are. The 152 uses a conventional 6-pack layout. It looks a little odd in this plane because of the clock being jammed in the middle there. Never really understand why Cessna did this one that way, but it doesn't matter. In the upper left is the most important gauge in all of flying, your airspeed indicator. Everything you do in flying is tied to an airspeed, and airspeed is always your critical number. The colored markings are important to know as they define different important limits. Airspeed is indicated in knots, nautical miles per hour. These are a little bit different from statute miles per hour, which is what you're used to from your car, but that's not really important to our discussion right now. The green arc shows the normal operating range. Basically, with the flaps retracted fully, the bottom of the arc at 40 knots is your approximate stall speed, the slowest the plane can fly. Stall is a complex thing, so let's not have the smart kids chiming in about how critical angle of attack and blah 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 right now. From 40 up to 110 knots is your normal operating speed for the 152. The yellow arc is only for very smooth air and very small control inputs, basically a warning range. You'll rarely go that fast, if ever. The little red mark at the end of the yellow arc is the never exceed speed, or VNE. Beyond that speed, you're risking damage to the plane. For now, I'm not going to get deep into V speeds, but each of these arcs is basically defining the beginning and end of some V range, V being velocity. On the inside of the green arc, you can also see a white arc underneath, and that comes down a little below 40 knots, and it extends up to 85. On the 152, this range is your flaps operating range. So that little extra bit at the bottom shows you that your stall speed comes down a bit to about 37 knots when your flaps are extended. And at 85 knots is the maximum speed you're allowed to have your flaps down without risking damage. That's enough about airspeed. Let's move on. Next to the airspeed is the attitude indicator. It shows the orientation of your aircraft in flight, brown representing the earth below you and blue is the sky. The little yellow bar in the middle more or less represents your wings, basically as if you were looking at your airplane from behind, and the little yellow dot in effect represents where the nose is. Markings on the blue and brown show pitch above or below the horizon, and the marks around the outside of the ring show your bank angle. Just to the right of the clock is the altimeter, and it tells us the altitude as a measure of feet above sea level. Not above the ground, unless that ground also happens to be at sea level. And yeah, I'm looking at you, Florida. If you're anywhere other than Florida, you're probably going to be at some distance above sea level. The altimeter reads just like a clock. The little hand is showing thousands of feet, the big hand is showing hundreds, and then there's that very skinny little guy there that shows tens of thousands, and really it's pretty much useless in the 152 because the number of tens of thousands you're ever going to go to in a 152 is never going to exceed 10,000 feet. Unless you hang some rockets on it or something, then, maybe. Back on the left-hand side on the next row is the turn coordinator, and we'll just get to that one later on when we're in flight. And in the middle there is the heading gyro. It shows your magnetic heading, but without all the headaches of being a compass. It's a gyro device. And we'll talk about some of the difficulties with magnetic compasses at a later time. But at the beginning of your flight, you basically just adjust this until it agrees with the compass, and then you recheck it from time to time as it may drift. But it's gyro driven, so when we're on the ground with the engine not running, it wanders quite a lot. Next to that is the VSI, or vertical speed indicator, and that shows how fast the aircraft is climbing or descending. And the best thing you can do with it right now in your early flying is just forget that I ever told you about it. Just cover it with a sticky note or something. It will cause you more trouble than it's worth early in your flying. Just if you need to know if you're going up or down, you can use the altimeter for that. If it's going up, you're going up. The two gauges that look like a crosshair are called omni-bearing indicators, and they're used for radio navigation, and they're way outside the boundaries of what we're going to be talking about for this flight, so let's not worry about those. They are both functional, though, in the default Cessna 152. The radio stack occupies most of the center of the dashboard there. That's where your communications radios, your intercom controls, and your transponder and navigation radios all live. We'll get into more detail on those as we're flying. If you're going to be using the Microsoft built-in ATC, you won't be touching most of that because for the most part it'll self-tune. But if you were ever using online air traffic control or flying in the real plane, knowing how those things work is going to become important. The last gauge that's actually important to us today is the tachometer, which is the round gauge just to the right of the radios, and it indicates the propeller RPM and therefore our power setting. And since the propeller is actually connected directly to the engine, it shows you your engine RPM as well. Up on the top of the dash are marker indicators. Those are really used for instrument flight, and honestly, by the time you really need to think about those, you probably won't be flying the 152 anymore. Over on the extreme right-hand side of the dash is the ADF, or Automatic Direction Finder. It is not frequently used anymore, but basically the way that guy works is you tune in a station, which would be marked on your charts, and the little pointer in the indicator gauge there shows you the direction toward it. Pretty simple thing, but it's not really used very often, so you probably will never refer to it. All right, so let's get started with getting the Cessna 152 up and running and into the air. I've pulled up the checklist here from Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's mostly correct, and it'll certainly get the default version of the plane off the ground. I also have the checklists for the plane from a pilot's operating handbook that I found online. These are easy to find for most planes, really, in Flight Simulator. There are a few, when you get into more advanced planes, it can be kind of tricky to come across. Usually the Microsoft ones are a little bit abbreviated, but most of the abbreviations that they do are things that you can't do in the sim anyways, like, check your seat harnesses and things. So as you can see, we're in the before starting engine checklist here, and this one just has fuel shut off and brakes. In the actual checklist for the planes, you see we have pre-flight inspection, which is the walk around, seats, belt, shoulder harnesses, which we can't do. Here's our fuel shutoff valve. We do that. Radios and electrical equipment to off. It's interesting that Microsoft left this one out because in this plane doesn't have a separate avionics switch. So in the real plane, you would want to be sure that you have all of your radios turned off. And you can see here, they're all turned on. The only way to turn these guys off in this plane is one at a time, just rolling this knob to off. And this transponder is already off. The reason this is done in the real plane is because you have surges going on in the electrical system when you're starting the engine, and the avionics can be sensitive, so you don't want to expose them to that. Most aircraft will have an avionics switch. If that's shut off, you're good, and then you just turn that on and all your radios come to life. But in the 152, it's just not like that. So that's one thing I would add that they don't have in their checklist, but it's totally not critical to the flight simulator plane. Moving on, we go start engine. Let's see if these are the same. So we have mixture rich, that's correct. Carb heat to cold, that's correct. Prime, that's correct. Throttle open 1/2 inch, those are the same. Propeller clear, you wouldn't, in Microsoft flights, this is you would open the window on the plane and shout out the window, hey, clear prop, which you'd look kind of silly doing sitting in your office. Master switch to on, ignition switch to start. Throttle adjust for 1,000, oil pressure in the green, which is correct. Beacon on. This actually should be performed earlier. Beacon should be on before you start the engine. So let's go through this checklist and get this bad boy started up. So going back to the before starting, we need the fuel shutoff valve to on. We need the brakes test and set. Brakes are set. And I can't, man, the lighting is terrible down there. I can't actually see if that switch is on or not. Well, I can't see that switch, so I don't know if it's on or not. If we try and start the plane and it doesn't start, that means it's not. Okay, I'm going to hide the yoke here so we can see what's going on. And we will go on to starting engine. Starting engine, we want mixture to rich. Mixture is the red knob we talked about. So rich is fully pressed forward. Carburetor heat, that's this guy. We want to push that in. Prime as required. I showed you the primer earlier. It's this guy down here. Not actually needed for flight simulator, but usually 2 or 3 squirts in the real plane or in add-ons that support it. Throttle open 1/2 inch. Well, that's a little vague when we're sitting here looking at a computer screen, but just a little bit on. Master switch to on. So we talked about this. That means both of these red guys on. And we can hear everything start to fire up. And we can go ahead and do ignition to start now. So first we have to go past right magneto, left magneto, both, and then the next one is start. Once you get the engine started, you adjust throttle to about 1,000 RPM. RPM is shown, of course, over here on the tachometer. And you can just adjust your throttle. The reason you run it at about 1,000 is just to help it warm up. These old carbureted engines, when they're just started up and they're cold, they tend to stall if you pull them all the way back to idle. So you don't want to do that. All right, oil pressure is up. Honestly, that would have been the first thing we should check. And the beacon, which should have been earlier, and I should have had on because I know better. At this point, nav lights can come on as well. Taxi lights can come on. Before we start to taxi, we would also normally get the radios turned on. In the real plane, you would go to standby on your transponder at this point, and when we go onto the runway, it goes to altitude reporting, ALT. Flying in the United States, VFR squawks 1200, which you can see here, this is on 0200 for some reason, so we want to set that to 1200. I believe it's 7,000 in most of the rest of the world. Okay, at this point we would dial up ATIS, get the weather, which we can do in the Microsoft ATC, which give us the rough thing. I don't have the audio for the radio turned on because I don't use it, but we can read down here. We know the wind is 258 at 4, which is the main thing I'm looking for because we already have the barometer. But what I wanted to know there was the wind direction, 258 at 4, and that's going to tell us which runway we want to go to. Now, a little trick you can use in Microsoft Flight Simulator if you wanted to know which runways there are available at the airport and you don't have any of the information, you can go in here to select a runway for takeoff, and it'll show you 8 and 26. So 26 would have a heading of 260, so that's closest to 258, which is the wind direction. So that's the one we want. So when we get on the taxiway, we're going to pick up going the opposite direction, which will be approximately 080 degrees, and that'll take us to the end we want to go to. So let's close that up. So we'll assume now we've been given our taxi clearance. So we're gonna, as we talked about before, we'd have the taxi light on, which I already did, verify the beacon's on and the nav lights are on, and we release the parking brake. Throttle up a little bit. And keep your taxi pretty slow. You can typically, once you get the plane moving, you can reduce the throttle a bit. Take our turns nice and slow. This is done with the rudder pedal, so I'm pushing to the right and to the left. And we're heading down basically eastbound because we know west is 270 degrees, and that's the way we want to be going when we take off. So we taxi down to the east end of the runway for departure. These little pylons in Flight Sim won't hurt you. There's a lot of airports where they are located incorrectly like that, so you can just ignore them. So before we go anywhere, we want to make sure that the airplane's functioning as it should. When we get to the end of the runway, we do the before takeoff checklist. So we set the parking brake. We know fuel's open, mixture to rich, which it is. And really, in a longer taxi, we would have leaned for taxi, but in Flight Simulator, it's not critical, so I didn't do it. Okay, and they're skipping the run up because Microsoft planes never fail. Coming over to the real book, so we do flight controls free and correct, which basically you can squat down a little here, and when you turn your yoke toward, for instance, we're looking out to the right, so when I turn it right, that aileron should go up, and it does. And when we turn left, it should come down, and it does. Opposite's true on the other side. When I turn to the left, it should go up. Right, it goes down, so that works. And out back, elevator up. Whoops. Oh, I thought that was a graphic glitch there. Freaked me out. And down goes down. And rudder left and right as expected. It's not really critical in Microsoft Flight Simulator to do that, but in the real world it is, because if the plane had been in for service or something and somebody hooked up a cable wrong and you didn't discover till you were in the air that something was working backwards, that would be a pretty scary ride. So that always gets checked. Flight instruments set. So we want to make sure that our heading indicator and our compass agree. So the compass is numbered from right to left up here. It's backwards of what you would expect. So we know that this is 24, so 230 here. And this would be 235, the small mark. Probably about 234, 233 is our actual heading there. So we want to compare that to this. Close. It was off by a couple. This little knob takes care of that for you. Want to verify our altitude is correct and our altimeter setting is correct. If you ever need to set that, the index is right here. So if it was, right now it's 2992, so you would dial it to 2990 and just adjust it by 2 to get there. So like 0, 1, 2. And if you know the altitude of the airfield you're flying from, you can cross-check here to make sure it's about right. So our instruments are set. That's number 4. Fuel valve is on. Mixture is rich, as we discussed before. That means the knob is pushed all the way in. Elevator trim for takeoff. So there's supposed to, I believe, be a mark here that shows just below the word off, a little index that points to this little nub that you can barely see because of the lighting here. It's right there. And if I move the trim, you see it move. So you want that to be just below the word off here is about right. Okay, and in the real book we go throttle to 1700, and this is the run up, and the reason we do it is just to make sure the engine's operating properly. So we want to get it stable at about 1700. Magnetos. Okay, so what we want to do here is check that we should see, when we turn off a magneto, we should see an RPM drop of not more than 125 RPM. And the difference between the two, the right and the left magneto, should not be more than about 50 RPM. Magnetos are interesting little devices that we'll talk about some other time. But so first we'll go to the left by clicking once on the key, and we'll see the RPM drops down to about 1600. So 100 RPM, that's fine. Go back to both, let it recover. Goes back to 1700. This time we're going to take it down to the right, so we do 2 clicks. 1, 2. And again, it comes down to about 1600. So they're very close together, so everything's correct there. Put it back to both. Okay, carburetor heat. As I mentioned in the earlier part, if you put hot air into the carburetor, it reduces the power, so we should see an RPM drop up here. So we pull, and it did come down a bit. It's a little over 1600. Push it back in, and it should recover. And it does. All right, all of our instruments, they need to remain in the green. M meter is over here. We want to make sure that it's charging, which is pointing to the right. If it's going to the left of the center, then that means that something's going on with the charging system. That would be bad. Suction gauge is right here, and you want it to be in its green arc. This guy, it's a vacuum system that drives the gyros, and the gyros drive your attitude indicator, your heading indicator here, and your turn coordinator. Those are all important, so we want to make sure that it's being driven properly. All right, with that completed, we can reduce throttle again to 1000. Okay, and then radio's set, which we're not going to bother with right now, but normally you dial up tower from here and let them know that you're ready to go. And if they gave you a transponder code, you would set that. It says radio set, flashing beacon, strobe, etc. on as required, so we'll do that when we roll across. Throttle friction lock doesn't exist in the sim, and release the brakes. All right, with all that done, we're ready to go. We would assume we've just talked to tower. Actually, there wouldn't be a tower here at Santa Ynez. We would announce on the traffic channel that we're ready to go to let everybody know we're about to take the runway, but we're going to skip that for now. And assuming we were at an airport with a controller, we would have just gotten our clearance. So assuming that we just got cleared to take off, we would set our altimeter to ALT. Taxi lights off, beacon and landing on, or beacon was on already, sorry, or should have been, and strobe. Nav lights are on. Okay, all those items are done. Oil temperature is registering above 0, so that's all we really need out of that. And we'll taxi out. All right, and we verify that our heading makes sense. And slowly to full throttle. Suction's in the green. Temps and pressures are in the green. Waiting for 50 knots. And rotate. Now, to maintain your airspeed on the climb out, you do that by pitch. So if you need to slow down, you pull back a little bit to go up steeper. And if you need to speed up, you can let the nose come down a bit. I'll show you how to use the trim once we get up a little bit of altitude. But you would trim here too to maintain whatever you're looking for. So in our case, 65 was what we wanted for our climb out. And we're pretty much holding that. I meant to tell you before we took off, but the airport altitude here is about 700 feet. So in typical pattern operations, in the United States at least, you would fly to about 1,000 feet, unless it's published to be something different, which occasionally it is, but most airports about 1,000 feet. So we'll go up to 1,700. We'll just start a turn here. I'm doing a left turn on the yoke and a little bit of left pressure on the rudders. And we'll roll out basically south 180 degrees. That'll put us basically kind of squared up to the runway over there. And we're at 1,700 feet now. So I let the nose come down, let the airplane accelerate. I'm going to get us turned eastbound here. This is kind of how you would do a regular pattern. And we'll pull the throttle back. Once we're on our altitude and our speeds come up, we can pull the throttle back to about 2300, 2400 RPM. And about eastbound now, so we'll roll out. And we'll fly down toward the reservoir over there, and we'll do a couple little maneuvers just to give you an idea how the plane works. For trim, so what's going on right now is if I completely let go of the controller, the plane wants to sink. So what we would do is just pull a little bit downward on the trim wheel down here at the bottom until it stops doing that. You're not really looking at the indicator, you're checking how it feels. And what you're looking to do is get it so that without touching the controller much, it pretty much just stays on the altitude you wanted it to. It's never going to be perfect, it's always going to drift a little, and I find that flight simulator's a little less stable than a real plane as far as just maintaining an altitude. But you can get it pretty close so that you don't have to constantly be hauling back on your controller. Let's go up to about 3,000 feet or so that we can talk a bit about leaning the engine with the mixture control. In this plane you can cruise climb at like 85 or 80 knots is reasonable. And we're coming up to 3,000 now. So we gently start to let the nose come down. Let the airplane accelerate. And once it gets up around 100 or 95 or 100 knots, it's time to pull the throttle back again to about 2300. Plane's trying to climb a little extra here. I think we got a bit of a thermal, so I'm pushing it back down, and we'll pull the throttle back. And I'm going to get us turned back to the west, so I'm going to make a left turn. I'll give a little bit of left yoke and a little bit of left rudder. And what I wanted to show you while we're making the turn here, ooh, bouncy. The ball here, okay, so this is kind of like a spirit level you've probably seen before, except it's a little ball in there instead of a bubble. And the idea in a turn is you add enough rudder to keep the ball in the center. If the ball is running off to the left, you need more left rudder. If the ball's running off to the right, then you need more right rudder. If I let off the rudder altogether, you can see the ball starts to drift out to the left a bit. So I just pull that back in. My altitude's drifted up a bit while I was talking, but I wanted to make sure you get that concept. Keeping that ball centered is an important part of making sure the airplane behaves the way it should, especially when you're going slow. Like if you're on final approach and you're all crooked, then you risk getting into a stall, and at low altitude that's particularly bad. The little airplane there is the other part of the turn coordinator, and what's that showing is when you put the wing right on that little index line, that means that you're doing a 2-minute turn, and all that means is that it'll take 2 minutes to make a full 360 holding the wing on that index. It's a standard turn that's used for instrument procedures. It's less important in daily VFR flying, but it can be important in certain circumstances, so that's what that's there for. So in a plane like this, you don't have any instrument a lot of times specific for working out the mixture, like a EGT, which is the exhaust gas temperature. But as you go higher, you need to lean the mixture a bit to keep the engine running efficiently. And the way you do that then, our altitude's going to go all over the place because it's just bumpy, and this plane doesn't have an autopilot, so we'll just deal with it. We know we're at about 2300 RPM there, and what we would do is start slowly pulling back the mixture, and that should increase a bit, which it's doing just a little, and then it'll start to go back down, which it's doing now. So you want to get it right to the peak RPM, which there's not much difference at this altitude. It's very fine adjustment. Actually, it's all the way in now. Come on. There, it dropped. So back up. Yeah, right now it's full rich regardless. Anyhow, if you were up higher, you would pull that until the power would a lot of times start to climb for a little bit, and then it'll peak and fall back. Once it does that, what you want to do is go back and find that peak, and then go just a little bit to the rich side of that. So you just like If you you can either just manually push the mixture in a little bit, or if you use your mouse wheel on this, it will roll in very fine increments. In the real plane, you would twist it a half turn or so to the rich side, maybe 1 turn. So that's the basics of how that works. We're going to descend now, and we'll go back and land the plane, and we'll wrap this up. There's a lot more we could get into, but we just want to have a basic introduction here. So to descend, you reduce the power first and let the plane start coming down. During your descent, you want to make sure your speed doesn't run away beyond the green here. And you can control it easily by just pulling back a little to slow down or trimming a little. And in effect, your pitch trim ends up being kind of a speed trim most of the time. So if I let go completely here, see it starts to dive and the speed runs away. So if I put it back to something more comfortable and I trim up a bit, and now I let go, and it stays here. So we're still descending, you can see over here, and you can see that our altitude trend is going down, but now it's not running away. If you go outside of the green on the RPM for your descent, then you need to add Carb-Heat. And this is what I was talking about before, where if you get into certain situations, your carburetor can ice up even on a warm day. So if you're outside of this green arc, the standard procedure is just to go ahead and pull your Carb-Heat in. It's like now we go down to like 1700. And we'll make a right turn here, so we'll keep the ball centered up in the turn coordinator. I know the airport's right over here. I don't know if you noticed it, but kind of was flying us back that way. It's right there. So we're real high. I'm just going to go ahead and pull it all the way back. We're going to fly out to the east a little bit because we know that the winds are coming from the west, so we want to land facing westbound. And when I get back down to about 1700 feet, which is here, this is the airport's pattern altitude where we would start from. So we check over here, line it up, when we get to the end of the runway here, want to set about 1500, 1700 RPM. And just kind of keep it level and let the airspeed come down. We're going to put in 1 notch of flaps now, which I'm going to do using the button, or you could use the lever on the dash. And you can see here the index moved down to 10, and our airspeed is coming down. So 65 is a good approach speed for this plane. Look out here when that runway is starting to get back behind us. I'm going to make a gentle turn, not more than about 20 degrees. Keeping an eye on the airspeed, don't let it get too slow. 60 is about the minimum. Actually 55 if I remember right in the 152. And keeping the ball centered down here. We'll lift the wing, get a look so we can see the runway over there. Put in a 2nd notch of flaps. And if you feel like you're coming down too quickly, add power. When you're in the airplane, especially when you're flying slow like this, you use power to control your descent, and you use pitch to control your airspeed. Oops, kind of overshot the runway there a bit. We'll turn back over here to get lined up. We're a little bit high. I can see the lights down there. We want to see a red and a white to know we're right on the slope. So I'm going to pull the throttle a bit. And it's okay to be high, just never be low. And I'm just making little pitch corrections to keep the airspeed right about between 55 and 60. And I'm using the throttle to control how fast we're descending. So I see we have a red and a white light down there now. That's good. Speed's good. And now we just keep it lined up with the runway using the controls. We're a little low here. It's okay because we're in the airport property, so we know we're not going to hit anything. And once you're over the runway end, you can pull the throttle to idle. And then you just wait for it to slow down. You just try and keep it off the ground as long as you can. And apply brakes, keep back pressure. Having the elevators sticking up helps to a little bit of aerodynamic braking. And we pull the flaps up when we come off the runway. You pull, in real life, you pull just beyond this line. That way you're clear of the runway. And then you, if you're at an airport that has a ground controller, you would contact them at that time. Carb-Heat back in. Flaps are up. Landing lights off. Strobe light off. At that point, we would have probably heard from the ground controller a taxi to our parking. Which we'll just say is right here. Again, we get the throttle back to about 1,000 RPM. Don't want it sitting slow like that. Parking brake on. And we can get the checklist out. Alright, after landing we did that, flaps up, carb heat cold, done. So securing the airplane, parking brake is set, radio's off. And actually, transponder should have gone to standby as soon as we came off the runway, but we can set that to off now. We can turn off all of our other lights, nav lights, we can leave the beacon on. And then a mixture to idle cutoff. So in an airplane, you don't just turn the key off. You just pull this, and that'll shut the engine down. Once it stops, they don't usually run that long, but okay. Ignition to off. Master switch off. And you would typically set the fuel back to off. So that's it. That's the basics of a flight in the 152. The finer points will come to you over time, but that's how to operate the airplane. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you in the next one.